Buddy, praying everybody's having a great day, and I'm glad you've taken the time to join us for this week's lesson as we continue our study through the miracles of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels. This is our Wednesday night Bible study that we do here at the Cloudcroft Church of Christ. And we've worked through a number of these miracles. We just finished the miracle on John chapter 9 where Jesus restores sight to a man who had been blind since birth. That was a very long study. This will be a very short study. In fact, I think we'll be able to get through tonight's miracle in one class. But there were two specific miracles that Jesus performed that were unique to the Messiah. One was healing the blind, the other was healing the deaf. And that's the miracle we're going to look at tonight. We're going to look at an example in the Gospels where Jesus heals a deaf and mute man. But we're going to start in the Old Testament. We're going to start in Isaiah chapter 35, verses 5 and 6. I'm going to read it from the NIV. Now, I'm not sure what translation is up there on the slide, but the NIV says, "Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert." So Isaiah predicted that when God's salvation comes, miraculous power comes with it. It is a miracle for the blind to see. It is a miracle for the deaf to hear, for the lame to run, and for the mute to speak. When John the Baptist was in prison, he became discouraged, and he began to wonder if Jesus really was the Messiah. When John's disciples brought this question to Jesus, Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." Matthew chapter 11, verses 4 through 6 from the NIV. Now, if Jesus didn't use the exact words of Isaiah 35, 5 and 6 here, he certainly used the idea. Jesus Christ is the Messiah. He was the promised one. He had come to bring God's salvation, and that was accompanied by miraculous power. When God's salvation comes, miraculous provision comes with it. What was dry and useless becomes well watered and fruitful. So we see Jesus fulfilling these prophecies of Isaiah 35. Now, that gets us to tonight's lesson. Jesus heals a deaf and mute man, Mark 7, verses 31 through 37. So I'm going to read that to you from the NIV, if you want to follow along in your Bibles, and then we'll go through it verse by verse using different translations. But we'll start with the full text from the NIV, Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. "Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee, and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, 'Ephphatha,' which means 'be opened.' At this the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. 'He has done everything well,' they said. 'He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak.'" Let's jump over to Matthew's Gospel real quick. Matthew's Gospel in chapter 15, verses 30 through 31 says that great crowds came to him, to Jesus, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking. Now that passage describes Jesus healing a great crowd that included the mute. Mark 7, verses 31 through 37, which we just read, mentions only this one healed man and is the only gospel to do so. It's possible that this one healing that we're going to study tonight in Mark 7 created the crowd that's mentioned here in Matthew 15. Healing the deaf is associated with God's direct blessing. It is a sure sign of the Messiah, as we just read in Isaiah 35. The Old Testament does not record any account of a literally deaf person being healed. Most mentions of deaf people are references to those who were spiritually hardened. And that's a deeper meaning to this lesson as well. But in the Old Testament, people raised others from the dead. Elijah and Elisha, by God's power, raised people from the dead. Lepers were cured. But no one was ever healed that was blind or deaf. Only Jesus performed those miracles. And in Mark 7, the people will praise Jesus not only for healing this deaf and mute man, but for doing it well. So there's some context. Again, the miracles we read about in Matthew 15 may have been the result of this miracle that we're going to study tonight. So let's dive into Mark 7:31. We'll start in the English Standard Version. I like to use all different types of versions. I like to use all the major translations. Here are the major translations of the Bible. Here's your lesson within a lesson. There's the English Standard Version, the New International Version, the New American Standard Version. There's a Christian Standard Bible, the CSB. I've started to incorporate that into my lessons. There's the New Living Translation, which is technically a paraphrase, but it is a very good paraphrase. Some people consider it a more liberal version of the Bible. I do not. In fact, it's actually harsher in some areas than other translations, but it is technically a paraphrase. Then you have the Old King James, which I do reference from time to time, but the English is so old in that it's really hard to understand. And then you have the New King James, which I like. My three favorite translations are the NIV, the New American Standard, and the New King James, quickly followed by the English Standard Version. The reason I go through and use different versions is so people can compare and contrast. There are people out there that think if you don't use one specific version, then you're a blasphemer and you're going to hell. I do not believe that. Most of the translations read the same on most of the stuff. There are instances in the translations where one translation reads differently. I go through different translations so that when those instances pop up, we can address them. But we're going to start in Mark 7:31 from the English Standard Version. Talking about Jesus, it says, "Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis." This is interesting. Mark tells again of Jesus continuing to be on the move. Jesus was really like an itinerant preacher. Jesus has just left the traditional borders of Israel, or he had previously left the traditional borders of Israel, and traveled to the city of Tyre, which is in modern-day Lebanon or ancient Phoenicia. There he had healed a little girl who was possessed by a demon. That's the miracle recorded just prior to this in Mark 7, verses 24 through 30. This is near the place where Elijah had raised a widow's son from the dead in 1 Kings chapter 17. Mark's description of the itinerary is one that has baffled biblical scholars for centuries. Let's look at a map. I love maps. There's a map you can see on your slide there. Gives you somewhat of an idea. This map doesn't depict the exact description I'm going to define for you, but it's pretty close. But basically, you get an idea of the region where Jesus is at. Jesus left Tyre. He went north to Sidon, made his way east, then came back south, then back up to the Sea of Galilee. This trip moved sort of in the shape of a horseshoe, but it took about 120 miles to go from Tyre back across, down and around, up, and into the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's a lot of traveling, isn't it? Tyre was originally an island city off the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. It was about 34 miles northeast of Capernaum. Sidon is also on the coast. It's about 20 miles north of Tyre. The text doesn't say that Jesus entered these cities, just that he went into the region of which Tyre and Sidon were significant population centers. Tyre and Sidon were inhabited primarily by Hellenized Greeks, Canaanites, pagans. The area was administered by Syria in service to the Roman Empire at the time Jesus is doing his earthly ministry. The region is also referred to as Syro-Phoenicia because of its ties to Syria, and Phoenicia for the purple dye the residents collected from Murex sea snails. Now, the Decapolis, by contrast, is east of Capernaum. It's on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. The northwestern arm borders the southeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee and the eastern shore of part of the Jordan River. The body of the district lies further east. Now, we talked about this when we looked at the miracle of Jesus healing a man who was possessed by a legion of demons, which also took place in this area, the Decapolis. Deca means 10. Polis refers to cities. So this area of the Decapolis was actually an area of 10 cities, which were actually city-states. They shared a similar culture, but were administratively independent of one another. It's all still part of the Roman Empire, though. Here's what's interesting about this. The route that Jesus takes sort of resembles Israel's wanderings in the wilderness during those 40 years. Jesus apparently designs this circuitous route to avoid the district of Galilee. Now, their exact location in the Decapolis isn't given, and neither is the particular shore on which Jesus earlier rescued the man possessed by a legion of demons, which we read about in Mark 5, 1 through 13. But this is in the same area. Now, if you look at that miracle, and I think it may still be up, but we studied it several weeks ago, the last time he had been in the Decapolis, which is when he healed the man possessed by a legion of demons, he drove those demons into a herd of pigs. What did the crowd do? They begged him to leave that area. They begged him to leave. But Jesus told that man to tell his friends what God had done for him. Mark 5, 14 through 20. Apparently, the man's testimony acts as a sort of target softening. And this time, the people are much more receptive. So Jesus has now returned. Now remember, the Gospels aren't necessarily written in strict chronological order. The divinely inspired writers of the Gospels, the divinely inspired writers of the Bible in general, were not strictly concerned with chronology. They were more concerned with the importance of events. But it's safe to say that this miracle takes place after the miracle of Jesus healing the man that was possessed by a legion of demons. And now he has returned to that area, but this time the people do not try to run him off. Instead, they are very receptive. And that gets us to verse 32. There we go, from the New American Standard. It says, "And they brought to him one who was deaf and had difficulty speaking, and they begged him to lay his hand on him." The last time Jesus and the 12 were in this area, the crowd drove him away. Mark 5:17. Now the villagers and farmers rush to greet him, hopeful he will heal this deaf man. Now let's look at some terms here. Deaf is from the Greek root word kophos. It means dull of hearing. The word often encompasses the state of being unable to speak as well. The phrase translated in the New American Standard as difficulty speaking belies the speculation that the man is completely mute. The Greek root word mogolelos means that either he speaks with difficulty or others find him difficult to understand. Either way, the description here suggests this man was not born deaf. And that the people asked Jesus to lay hands on this man indicates that the disability may have been caused by some sort of trauma. They, at least, did not believe it was due to demon possession like the mute man in Matthew 9:32 through 34. In Mark's account, when Jesus heals physical ailments, he typically touches the victim. Mark 1:31, Mark 5:41, Mark 6:5, Mark 8:25 are all examples of that. When he frees people from demons, he does so with the power and authority of his words, as in Mark 1:25 and as in Mark 5, verses 7 and 8. It appears also that the local people like or respect this deaf man. Much like the crippled man who was let through the ceiling in Mark chapter 2 and the blind man at Bethsaida in Mark chapter 8, they bring this man to Jesus. Neither the man with the legion of demons nor blind Bartimaeus, who we read about in Mark chapter 10, received such a courtesy. Remember in Mark 5, the man possessed by demons, the people were scared and terrified of him. So we get to Mark 7:33. We'll look at this from the Christian Standard Bible. It says, "So he took him away from the crowd in private." He, of course, being Jesus. So Jesus takes this man away from the crowd. It says, "So he took him away from the crowd in private. After putting his fingers in the man's ears and spitting, he touched his tongue." Now, let's just clear one thing up. Jesus did not need to spit. He did not need to put his fingers in the man's ears to heal the man. He heals people using different methods. He uses different things, but those things aren't required for the healing. Jesus can just say the word and the man will be healed. But we don't know what the deaf man thinks of all this. What we do know here is that Jesus is very gentle with this man. The man seems to be in a vulnerable state. He's likely scared. Jesus doesn't use him as a public object lesson, like he does the woman with the issue of blood in Mark 5:25 through 34, or the Canaanite woman in Mark 7:24 through 30. Instead, Jesus pulls him away perhaps so the man will not be overwhelmed when his hearing returns. Then Jesus lets the man know what's going to happen. Now, spit was thought to have healing powers in Jewish and Greek tradition, and Jesus also used spit when healing the blind. We saw that in the last miracle we studied in John chapter 9, though the spit did not have any power in and of itself. By going through the process of touching the man's ears and tongue, Jesus invites the understanding of the man who cannot hear what was going on. So the touch here was likely to reassure this gentleman, to comfort this gentleman, to let this gentleman know, hey, everything's going to be okay. I'm your friend. I'm here to help. This is very similar to how Jesus heals the blind man in Mark 8:22 through 26. People bring the man to Jesus, but Jesus leads the man out of the village, spits on his eyes, and heals him. It's important to remember that we can bring our friends to Jesus, but his work is an intimate experience between himself and the one who needs the spiritual healing. We cannot spiritually heal anybody. Only Christ can do that. And we need to trust in Christ to do that. So look at Mark 7:34 from the New Living Translation, that liberal paraphrase that some people don't like. But hey, I like the way it reads on some stuff. Here it says, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said, Ephphatha, which means be opened. Jesus and the disciples are in Decapolis, possibly near the southeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. A group of people have brought him a man who is deaf and who cannot speak clearly. Jesus has pulled him away from the crowd and indicates what he plans to do. Jesus often looks up in situations where he wishes to direct attention to God, notably when he feeds the 5,000 in Mark 6:41 or when he raises Lazarus in John 11:41. That term there, Ephphatha, is either Hebrew or Aramaic for be opened. Just like the raising of the little girl from the dead in Mark 5:41, Mark records the original words, perhaps to show that Jesus is not using some sort of magic spell. This also points to the humanity of Jesus. Jesus was fully God, but he was also fully human. And there's a lot of confusion over the fact that although Jesus is God, he often prayed to God. The topic touches on the nature of the Trinity and whether Jesus is all-powerful during his life on earth. Jesus clearly states that as a person, he is separate from the Father. John 5:19 through 27 talk about that. In fact, Philippians 2:7 tells us that he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. Hebrews 2:14 through 18 reminds us, and I encourage you to read that in your own time, that he was fully human in every way. In his time on earth, we know that Jesus learned obedience to God. Hebrews 5 and verse 8 talks about that. He prayed often. Mark 1:35, Mark 6:46 are just a couple of examples of that. John 5:19 says that Jesus did nothing apart from the Father. Jesus was fully God, but he was also fully man. And he's the only perfect man who ever lived. And he serves as our example. And no matter how much we think we have, how much we think we know, how much we think we have what we need, we still need to ask for God's provision. We still need to trust in God with all of our heart and take our needs to him. And that brings us to verse 35, the next slide in the presentation. We'll get it up. There it is. From the New King James, immediately his ears were opened and the impediment of his tongue was loosed and he spoke plainly. This fulfills the prophecy we started with in Isaiah 35:5 and 6 as I drank this last sip of coffee. To get myself awake this morning. Notice when Jesus heals, it's immediate most of the time. The healing of the deaf and mute is a prophecy. It directly identifies the work of the Messiah. Many of Jesus' miracles point to a spiritual truth beyond the physical reality. Opening the eyes of the blind is a reminder that we are spiritually blind and in darkness without Christ. Opening this man's ears points to the fact that we cannot truly comprehend spiritual reality without his work in our hearts. Let's look at the deeper spiritual truth in some other verses. 1 Corinthians 2:14 from the NIV says, the person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit. Romans 10 and verse 17, consequently, faith comes from what? Hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. A lot of stuff there. I can't go back on the slides, though I wish I could, but Mark 7:35 says, immediately the man's ears were opened and his tongue was loosened. Jesus brings physical healing to this man. But it's more than just the physical healing. It's the spiritual healing. There's a deeper truth in that, and we see that in 1 Corinthians 2 and in Romans chapter 10. Let's move back to the story in Mark 7:36. Back to the English Standard, it says, and Jesus charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. This is one of those things that has often baffled me about Jesus' earthly ministry. Very rarely does Jesus tell those that he has healed to spread the word. Now, in the account in Mark 5 where he heals the man from a legion of demons, he did give the order to that man to go and tell people what he had done. And that may be the reason why the crowd is so receptive to Jesus in this instance. May be the reason why Jesus is crowded with those who need healing now. It may be the reason for the crowds in Matthew 15, 30 and 31 that we read earlier. But most of the time, Jesus tells whoever he has healed to either remain quiet or show themselves to the priest for verification, as in the case when he cures leprosy. Mark 1:44, Luke 17:14 are a couple of examples of that. When word does spread, the sheer number of people who want him delays the more important work of training the disciples, and sometimes threatens Jesus' safety. Mark 3 and verse 9. Today, we need to be careful how we proclaim Jesus. And here's the deal. Part of the issue that came from all of these crowds is the same issue you get today with people that depend on the government for everything. They just want the stuff. It's kind of like the open borders policy. I've got a lesson on that somewhere that I'll do sometime, but they just rush in to get the freebies. In other words, a lot of people come to Jesus for the wrong reasons. It's not because they want to know God, it's because they want to get fixed. They want free food. They want, well, what can you do for me physically? So we need to be careful how we proclaim Jesus. He gives us specific promises in his word that tell us what to expect in a life devoted to him, and it is completely opposite of the so-called prosperity gospel that a lot of false teachers are out there peddling today. To truly come to Christ, the Christian life includes gifts for the service of others, not for ourselves. It brings with it a conviction of our sins, John 16:7 through 11. Forgiveness, Acts 13:38, as well as persecution, 2 Timothy 3:12. Being a Christian, coming to Christ, does not guarantee complete or instantaneous physical healing. 2 Corinthians 12:7 talks about that. It doesn't guarantee fully healed relationships. Look at Matthew 10:35. It doesn't promise an easy lifestyle. Look at Matthew 8:20. Nor does it guarantee a long physical life. Acts 7:54 through 60. Look at Stephen when he was martyred. He died young. A lot of the apostles died young. It does promise healing and restoration, but that's not necessarily physical healing and restoration. The bigger picture is the spiritual. Jesus certainly can bring physical healing and restoration, as he does to this man. And I'm not saying we shouldn't pray for those things, but we have to learn to look beyond the physical to the spiritual, look beyond the temporal to the eternal. Full restoration and full healing is not guaranteed during this earthly life, but we will be made whole in eternity with Christ. Jesus did not want those he healed to proclaim what he had done yet, because physical healing was not and is not his primary mission. Like any miracle, the healings and the exorcisms affirm his position as the Son of God. John 10:37 through 38. In fact, the miracles in John's gospel are recorded specifically to prove Jesus is the Messiah. The 7 signs is what those are referred to. But the physical stuff is secondary to the more important purpose: to reveal the way of salvation and to train others to spread the gospel after Christ returns to the Father. Many seek signs. Many want signs. But the gospel is Jesus Christ and Him crucified, 1 Corinthians 1:21 through 23. It is this message that we need to spread. Mark 7 and verse 37, people were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. When the crowd brings the deaf man with a speech impediment to Jesus, they don't ask Him to heal the guy, but simply to lay His hands on him, Mark 7:32. It could very well be that the people don't expect healing, but maybe just a blessing. The original Greek that is translated in the NIV as people were overwhelmed with amazement means to be struck with amazement, as if someone hits you. When the crowd says that Jesus has done everything well, it suggests they knew of His success in healing in other areas, perhaps from the man Jesus freed from a legion of demons in Mark 5. Now, although the term for speech impediment is used in Mark 7:32, here the crowd seems to say the man was mute. The Greek root word alelos can mean completely speechless or just impossible to understand. Regardless, now the man can speak. Now he can speak clearly. And again, the healing helps fulfill the messianic prophecy in Isaiah 35:5 and 6, in which God promises, "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy." Despite Jesus' request that the crowd keep this secret, they can't contain it. And before long, He will pull away to a mountain where many will demand healing, including the prophesied lame, blind, and crippled. And again, this may be recorded in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 15, verses 29 through 31. Nevertheless, the day will grow late and the people will get hungry. And that will bring us to the next miracle we will look at, the feeding of the 4,000, which is recorded in the very next chapter, Mark chapter 8. And that'll be the miracle we begin to look at next week. There's several miracles we've looked at. We've looked at 3 examples of Him casting out demons. We've looked at 3 examples of Jesus raising the dead. We've looked at an example of Jesus healing the blind. We've looked at an example now of Jesus healing the deaf. We have not yet looked at the examples of Jesus' miracles over the natural world or over creation. So next week we're going to look at the example of Jesus feeding the 4,000. We're also in future lessons over the next few weeks going to look at the example of Jesus calming the storm, and we're going to look at the example of Jesus healing the 10 lepers. Those are the next 3 miracles that we will look at, but we'll start next week in Mark chapter 8 with the feeding of the 4,000. In the meantime, I thank you for joining us for today's lesson. I hope it challenged you. I hope it encouraged you. Pray that you'll take time as you find time, dig deeper into the scriptures we looked at today. Please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't make me anything, but it will help to get more biblically based truth out there to the world. Praying everybody has a blessed week. Take care, and God bless.